Welcome in. We know exactly who is listening today.
We really do.
Yeah, you are a working planner. You're currently deep in the trenches, preparing for a major professional certification exam, and you are looking for that analytical edge to elevate your understanding of the field.
And that is exactly what we are here to provide.
Right. Today's deep dive is laser-focused on helping you absolutely master a vital piece of required reading. We are talking about the 2021 article, Are We Planning for Equity? Equity Goals and Recommendations in Local Comprehensive Plans by Carolyn G. Lowe and Rose Kim.
It is honestly a phenomenal piece of literature to have in your professional toolkit.
Oh, absolutely.
And we're going to treat this session as a comprehensive breakdown of the entire study, because this source, it isn't just abstract planning theory.
No, it's not.
It's a rigorous, empirical look at 48 local comprehensive plans in the state of Michigan. The authors basically set out to determine if local planners are actually practicing what they preach when it comes to social equity.
So we're going to walk you through the methodology, unpack the data, and detail the real-world case studies. That way you can confidently integrate these insights into your practice, and especially your professional essays.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this from the ground up, starting with the first major section of their research, which is equity as a planning goal.
Right.
The authors kick things off by anchoring their study in a massive cornerstone of planning theory, Scott Campbell's 1996 Planner's Triangle.
Yeah, if you are prepping for your certification, you probably see this triangle when you close your eyes.
Seriously, I mean, it argues that a sustainable future requires balancing three equal pillars, right? Economic development, environmental protection, and social equity.
But balancing those three in the real world is incredibly complex.
It is.
And Lowe and Kim do a really great job detailing the inherent tensions that Campbell originally identified in that triangle. You have the property conflict.
Which is the tension between equity and economic growth.
Right. Think of the classic everyday battles over gentrification versus preserving affordable housing. That's the property conflict. Then you have the development conflict, which pits social equity against environmental preservation. But what is really insightful here is that Lowe and Kim point out that Campbell might have actually overstated that development conflict.
Oh, how so?
Well, the authors argue that activities which are environmentally harmful almost always disproportionately hurt disadvantaged people. So protecting the environment and protecting vulnerable populations, they aren't always competing interests. They very often go hand in hand.
That makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
But planning history hasn't exactly always been the poster child for social justice, right?
Let's be real, it definitely hasn't.
So how did the profession shift from historically using tools like zoning for explicit exclusion to officially adopting equity as one of those three core pillars?
It was a hard-fought evolution. The researchers traced this back to the 1960s when we saw a major shift toward advocacy planning, bottom-up, community-driven approaches. A prime example of the authors highlight is the work of Norman Krumholtz.
Oh, in Cleveland, right, during the 1970s.
Exactly. Krumholtz and his staff essentially challenged planning professionals to stop just serving downtown business interests and to actively represent the interests of low-income and working-class neighborhoods.
He actively worked to provide more choices to those who had few. He pushed back hard against the political grain of the time.
He really did. And that history is highly relevant for a working planner today because it sets the stage for our modern ethical framework.
By the 1990s, the AICP Code of Ethics officially mandated that a planner must strive to expand choice and opportunity, with a special responsibility to disadvantaged groups.
But here is the catch that Lowe and Kim point out.
Yeah.
Despite this crystal clear ethical mandate, equity remains the most neglected of the three pillars.
Wow, still.
Still, in actual practice, genuine efforts to promote equity are frequently watered down, de-emphasized, or carefully disguised as efficiency or economic benefit goals.
Just to make them politically palatable to city councils.
Exactly. Which brings us to a crucial question that the authors force us to confront. What does equity actually mean, and what does it look like in tangible planning practice?
Right, because equity is a buzzword. It gets thrown around endlessly in municipal documents.
It really does.
Yeah.
So how do Lowe and Kim cut through the noise and define it?
What's fascinating here is that they define it with a word that often makes politicians extremely nervous.
Redistribution.
Yes. The authors argue that fundamentally, equitable planning is about redistributing public resources in favor of those who are less well off.
And for your exam, you need to know who that includes. That includes people of color, low-income individuals, people with disabilities, women, and the elderly.
Equity actively seeks to expand choices and increase agency for groups who are the most lacking in political and financial power.
And to make that definition useful, the study breaks down what this redistributive planning looks like across several specific subfields. Let's look at public participation first. The baseline expectation for equity here is an inclusive process where at least some actual power is transferred to non-experts in the community. But, and this is a big but, the authors attach a major warning label to this.
Yeah, they note that relying heavily on communicative planning can sometimes severely disadvantage marginalized groups.
Exactly. If your idea of public participation is expecting working-class residents or single parents to show up to a 3-hour neighborhood workshop on a Tuesday night, you aren't transferring power.
You're just reinforcing existing power structures that favor people with abundant free time.
Precisely. That is such a vital nuance to keep in mind. Then, moving to the subfield of housing, the authors outline the massive everyday challenge of NIMBYism.
Not in my backyard.
Right, where affluent communities fight tooth and nail against housing for middle and low-income residents.
So to plan equitably in the housing sector means pushing for missing middle housing, adopting inclusionary zoning regulations, and allowing accessory dwelling units or ADUs.
And when they talk about inclusionary zoning here, they aren't just talking about abstract density. They're explicitly linking it back to that core definition of equity.
Redistribution.
Yes, it is about redistributing power and resources by forcing affordable options into high-opportunity neighborhoods.
We also have the environment subfield.
Right.
Equitable planning here requires planners to recognize the hard, spatial reality that disadvantaged people are far more likely to live in lower quality housing, they are geographically more vulnerable to natural and human-caused hazards, and they simply have fewer financial resources to evacuate or rebuild after disasters.
You cannot plan for the environment without planning for the people most exposed to it.
Absolutely. And finally, regarding community facilities and transportation, equity means aggressively seeking to correct historical inequities in how amenities like parks, libraries, and schools are distributed.
And for transportation, it is about providing spatially consistent access and multi-mobility options.
Like robust transit and protected bike infrastructure.
Right, not just funneling municipal funds into wider roads for private cars.
Okay, so with all of those theoretical baselines established, the authors wanted to see if local governments are actually embedding these redistributive ideas into their long-range comprehensive plans.
Which brings us to the study context and the methodology they used, because understanding how they gathered their data is essential to grasping the weight of their findings.
The setting for this research is the state of Michigan. Now, Michigan is highly politically fragmented. It has 1,856 local units of government.
Counties, cities, townships, villages.
Yeah, and most of them conduct their own independent zoning and planning. They're required to update their plans every 5 years.
But crucially, while these comprehensive plans form the legal backbone for zoning ordinances, the plans themselves are not legally binding documents.
Right. So to measure the actual equity content within these 9 binding plans, the researchers utilized something called the Equity Evaluation Tool,
Which was a framework created by the Michigan Association of Planning's Social Equity Committee.
the MAP committee.
Yes. It is a publicly available, standardized checklist. And the beauty of this tool is that it is designed so that anyone, without any specialized local knowledge about a community's unwritten policies or political dynamics, can evaluate a plan based purely on what is actually written on the page.
For the study itself, they pulled a sample size of 48 local comprehensive plans.
And the way they evaluated them is a fascinating example of citizen science.
Yeah, they didn't just lock a bunch of academic researchers in a room to read these documents.
Yeah.
They recruited 24 volunteer planners from across the state to evaluate the plans using that MAP checklist.
But anytime you rely on volunteers for data collection, you run into the issue of consistency. The researchers knew they had to make sure this data was bulletproof for the study to hold up.
Right.
So they tested for intercoder reliability to reconcile any disagreements between how the volunteer coders interpreted a plan and how the researchers themselves interpreted it.
And they used a specific statistical measure to do this, called Krippendorf's alpha.
Or KELFA. Basically, this is a mathematical way of flagging specific survey questions where the volunteers and the researchers fundamentally disagreed on whether a plan met an equity standard.
Once they flagged those discrepancies, the researchers went back, reevaluated the text, and reconciled every single disagreement to ensure the final data set was completely solid.
Okay, so they've trained the volunteers, they have this rigorous MAP checklist, and they unleash them on these 48 plans to see what's actually in them.
What's the final verdict? Did these municipal plans pass the test?
Here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean the descriptive results are honestly quite sobering.
Yeah.
The researchers provide a very detailed breakdown of the specific elements found in these plans. As a professional, you need to understand the gravity of these statistics.
Hit us with the numbers.
First off, out of the 48 plans reviewed, only 46% contain the words equity, equality, fairness, or justice anywhere in the document.
Wait, less than half.
Less than half.
Even after the AICP mandated an ethical responsibility to equity decades ago, more than half of these long-range plans don't even use the word.
That is a massive disconnect between planning theory and local practice.
It really is.
And the gaps become even more apparent when you look at the details. Only 42% of the plans bother to identify geographic areas within their borders that are underserved or have particular social needs.
Wow.
Now, 65% of the plans do broadly identify groups of residents who are underserved. But the researchers point out a glaring caveat.
What's that?
90% of the demographic analyses in these plans only look at age.
Oh?
They might talk about the need for senior housing, but they essentially ignore race and income entirely in their demographic breakdowns.
And the environmental side is equally neglected. Less than a quarter of the plans mention equitable environmental protection, such as mitigating industrial noise or improving air quality in specific underserved neighborhoods.
Furthermore, only 6% mention environmental justice, and a mere 4% talk about ensuring equitable protection from natural hazards like flooding.
When you zoom out and look at the bigger picture of these findings, the authors highlight a very stark trend. General, broadly accepted, good planning recommendations appear with massive frequency compared to explicitly equity-focused recommendations.
Right. For instance, a general goal like promoting walkability is found in 73% of the plans.
Now, walkability can certainly improve equity by making it easier for people without cars to get around, but it's also widely popular for a dozen other reasons.
Like public health or retail foot traffic.
Exactly. On the flip side, an explicitly redistributive policy, like adopting inclusionary zoning, was only found in 6% of the plans.
Planners and politicians are clearly far more comfortable adopting broad, universally popular recommendations than they are adopting policies whose primary stated purpose is the explicit redistribution of resources to the marginalized.
So they have this mountain of data detailing exactly what is missing from local comprehensive plans. How do they figure out the why? How do we know what actually drives a community to adopt equitable policies?
To figure out the why, the researchers used a statistical model called a negative binomial regression.
Which sounds incredibly dense.
It does, but it is essentially just a mathematical way of isolating exactly which factors caused a town to prioritize equity while weeding out all the random statistical noise and correlations.
Okay.
They tested several hypotheses about what kind of communities write equitable plans, and there was a major surprise in the results.
Yeah.
They originally hypothesized that communities with more racial diversity or communities with lower median household incomes would naturally show a stronger equity focus in their planning documents.
That sounds logical.
But the regression models proved that racial homogeneity and median household income were not statistically significant factors at all.
Really?
Really, the demographics and the wealth of the community did not dictate the equity focus of the plan.
That is a critical insight for your professional understanding. It's not about the wealth or the racial makeup of the town.
So what actually moves the needle? The researchers isolated 4 specific variables that were statistically significant drivers of equity recommendations.
Okay, what's number 1?
First, and this was by far the biggest driver, capacity. For every additional credentialed planner a municipality had on staff, their comprehensive plan was expected to include 31% more equity-focused recommendations.
That is a huge jump.
Huge. Second was the plan year. Newer plans are simply better at this. For every year newer the plan was, it was expected to include 3% more equity-focused recommendations.
Which tells us that the major equity initiatives championed by organizations like the APA and MAP over the last decade are, in fact, slowly percolating down to the local level over time.
Third was public participation. For every additional mode of public participation a town used, like combining a standard digital survey with targeted focus groups and neighborhood block parties, there was a 14% increase in equity-focused recommendations.
And the fourth significant variable was geography. Coastal communities, meaning those touching one of the Great Lakes, had 49% more equity-focused recommendations than inland communities.
The authors explain that facing down massive coastal flooding and climate vulnerability forces a town to have hard conversations about equitable protection and who actually has the resources to rebuild.
Which inevitably embeds equity deeper into the plan.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, let's circle back to that first factor, capacity, because it is arguably the most actionable finding for the planning profession.
Right.
Having more credentialed in-house planners on staff drastically increases a plan's equity focus. The authors explain that trained planners genuinely care about equity.
When they work full-time in a single community, they develop deep, independent knowledge of that place's specific social landscape.
Yes. They use their professional expertise to actively nudge the town toward an equity focus, leading difficult conversations with the city council about what equitable planning actually looks like locally.
Contrast that dynamic with external consultants.
Oh, this is fascinating.
The researchers point out a wild statistic. Consultants were involved in writing 85% of the plans in this study.
85%.
Yet, the regression model showed that the involvement of a consultant was not a statistically significant factor in increasing equity recommendations.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Right. If you hire a contractor to paint your living room white, they aren't going to tell you that blue is better for your mental health. They just paint it white.
Exactly. Consultants often only know what local officials tell them about a community during kickoff meetings, and their business model relies on writing what those local officials want to hear to get the contract approved.
If the local government isn't already pushing for redistributive equity, a consultant is highly unlikely to rock the boat. It takes dedicated, in-house staff capacity to champion those policies.
Precisely. So how do we practically apply these lessons?
The final section of the article transitions from identifying the flaws to highlighting actionable takeaways and good practices. The authors pulled specific examples from their study of communities doing this work correctly.
If you get a high-level essay question on exclusionary zoning or equitable engagement, these municipal case studies are the perfect real-world evidence you can use to anchor your professional arguments.
Let's explore these examples. First is Livingston County.
Right. They didn't just relegate equity to a single, easily ignored chapter at the back of the document. They used it as the organizing principle for their entire plan.
They created a dedicated 10-page social equity section that explicitly framed complex issues like the aging population, access to core municipal services, and regional mobility strictly through an equity lens.
By doing so, they created a foundational model that smaller local governments within their county could emulate.
Next is Fenton Charter Township. Remember earlier when we discussed how average demographics often mask deep inequalities?
Fenton tackled this beautifully through mapping. As part of their demographic section, they included a specific families in poverty map.
While the overall poverty rate in the broad township is quite low, this GIS map visually proved that families living in poverty are highly concentrated in one specific corner of the township,
reaching rates as high as 33% in a single block group.
This map made a vulnerable group of people geographically visible to decision makers. Without that spatial analysis, those families would have been completely erased by a broad, township-wide statistical average.
Another incredibly practical example is the city of Richmond.
When dealing with the housing subfield, they didn't just vaguely mention a desire for affordable housing.
No, they conducted a highly specific housing needs assessment. They explicitly planned to provide affordable housing alternatives targeted at young families and seniors.
Most importantly, they looked at what affordability actually meant in their specific local context based on their existing housing stock.
Rather than relying on skewed regional area median incomes that often allow developers to build affordable units that local residents still can't actually afford to rent.
For the transportation subfield, the researchers highlight Benton Charter Township. They are a rural community without a traditional public transit system.
But they didn't let that stop them from prioritizing equitable mobility. They proactively included rural complete streets policies in their plan,
ensuring that any new developments must feature wide, paved shoulders or accompanying separated bike paths to provide safe, non-motorized options for residents who cannot drive.
It's a great reminder that equity isn't just an urban issue.
And regarding environmental hazards, we have the coastal city of Bridgman.
They went far beyond just listing potential natural hazards in a table. They conducted hazard-specific vulnerability assessments.
They mapped out the spatial reach of lakeshore flooding, severe windstorms, and extreme heat events. Then they specifically analyzed how those exact hazards are likely to intersect with and affect their most vulnerable populations.
Like residents living below the poverty line or those with mobility disabilities, to ensure their emergency response and mitigation strategies provided equitable protection.
Finally, for public participation, the study praises the city of Kalamazoo.
They recognized early on that a multifaceted approach was absolutely necessary to reach historically marginalized groups.
They didn't just hold a town hall on a weekday evening and call it a day.
They actively partnered with established neighborhood leaders, local minority-owned businesses, nonprofits, and religious institutions.
They brought the planning process to the people by hosting community-wide events and showing up at neighborhood block parties.
Their outreach tools included everything from leaving informational flyers in neighborhood free little libraries to publishing notes in local newsletters and running extensive, targeted social media engagement campaigns.
Those are phenomenal practical examples of how to actually do the work. And tying all of this together, Lowe and Kim offer a final, overarching recommendation for daily planning practice.
Planners must make land use changes ruthlessly transparent.
How? By fully utilizing GIS. The authors stress that planners should explicitly link land use decisions to the undeniable spatial facts on the ground.
You must use GIS to overlay your future land use maps with hard data like flood hazard zones, public transit routes, and the locations of community facilities.
That visual transparency is the ultimate tool for accountability.
If you overlay those spatial maps, it removes all plausible deniability. It becomes immediately visually apparent to both the city council and the general public if a proposed future land use plan is actively putting vulnerable people in harm's way.
Or if it is continuing to distribute municipal amenities inequitably.
It forces a conversation about redistribution that might otherwise be quietly ignored in a text-heavy zoning document.
So what does this all mean? Let's synthesize the core professional takeaways you need to carry forward.
First, equity is mathematically and practically neglected in comprehensive plans compared to environmental and economic goals. Less than half of the plans evaluated even use the word.
Second, the demographics or wealth of a town do not predict its commitment to equitable planning.
Third, the statistically proven ways to correct this neglect are increasing internal planning capacity by hiring more staff planners who will champion these issues.
Utilizing robust, multimodal public participation to actually reach marginalized voices.
And explicitly mapping disparities and future land uses through GIS to force transparent decision-making.
If you can articulate those core findings, explain the methodology behind how they isolated those variables, and illustrate your argument with the real-world mapping and housing examples from Fenton or Richmond,
You're going to demonstrate a profound, high-level understanding of applied planning on your certification. You now have the data, the methodology, and the practical applications fully unpacked.
It is a truly illuminating piece of research that challenges a lot of assumptions about how planning gets done.
It absolutely does. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you continue advancing in your profession. The research clearly shows that traditional zoning and everyday planning practices have historically been utilized to advance exclusionary and discriminatory agendas. And the modern data proves that even today, well-meaning planners frequently feel forced to disguise equity as efficiency just because it's politically safer.
Yeah.
This raises an important question for your exam and your future career. If the foundational tools of local planning like traditional zoning codes and comprehensive land use mapping were originally designed to exclude CanSign, simply adding equity checklists and hiring a few more planners truly dismantle that legacy.
Or does the entire fundamental mechanism of the comprehensive plan need to be reinvented from scratch?
Exactly.
That is a brilliant and challenging question to chew on as you continue your preparation. Thank you for joining us today. Keep diving deep, trust your preparation, and we will catch you next time.